When it comes to transformation or reprogramming the subconscious mind, how important is the story that we tell ourselves throughout the process?
Give me an example. So, what story would you be one might be telling themselves during the process?
I'm not good enough. I'm never going to be able to make it. I failed so many times. Like, how important is it to shift that perspective throughout that process?
Got it. So, the process really is about bringing awareness to those like deep subconscious constraints. So, in terms of your question, the story we tell ourselves during the process, it's more the story we're revealing during the process, right? So, for me, life is revelatory, is what I say. So, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with one of my more popular quotes where life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free. And so this is what we're wanting to do wherever we get triggered, wherever we get upset, wherever somebody says something that pisses us off or the circumstances of our life aren't the way we want them. That's what we're revealing are these I'm not enough, I'm not loved, I'm not safe. So they are, to me at least, these deep subconscious prisons. So once we reveal them, then we get to go to the next stage, which is one, kind of embrace them, love them. That's part of my humanity. Everybody's got them, right? I'm not such a freak that I think I'm not good enough. Everyone can relate to that. So profound acceptance. And then secondly, investigating really the validity of that statement. Like, is it an actual truth? Or is it the byproduct of certain things that transpired in my childhood, usually where my elder sibling got all the attention for being an academic or an athlete? And then, ipso facto, I decided, therefore, I'm less than, right? So it's really just investigating these deep patterns and programs, wondering, checking, is that an actual truth? Is that really who I am? And then discovering really what's on the other side of that, which is total freedom, hence my main product and my membership program.
And I don't know if we talked about this before, we may have, but I think it's an important thing to kind of double down on in that people have a hard time separating reality from truth, right? Like something that really happened to them in their childhood or a mistake they actually made versus what's being presented to themselves in the current moment. Like what's the process like to be able to like authentically separate those two things so that you can, I mean, not just suppress what may have happened to somebody in the past, but also not accept it as this permanent truth.
So I think we honor both, right? Like, so everybody's reality to them is invariably over time certainly becomes their truth. And we want to sort of just gently tease those apart and go, okay, I can honor your reality, but I'm not going to, condone the fact that you went through whatever you went through as something to dismiss. Like, no, people go through abhorrent things. There's atrocious events that transpire in people's childhoods for which we want to have a real deep sense of compassion and understanding. So that is a reality. What we want to be able to pry apart is the fact that, again, that to them means a truth about who they are because they were adopted. That's a reality, and that could be hard. And maybe the sort of family that they moved into wasn't, to begin with, very loving, and that's hard. So we can have compassion for that. But then does that mean what they might adopt as no pun intended, but as a subconscious pattern that they're not wanted because their biological family gave them up, right? We want to be able to uncollapse reality from the story that we are making reality mean fundamentally, and that's a delicate practice, and it's a very sensitive subject sometimes for people because certainly when there's real abuse, there's horrific things that happen to kids, and that can become very entrenched in their own perception of reality to the point that they'll actually defend it, which of course is what the ego does. Its imperative is to be right, even though what it's being right about is usually some inadequacy or insecurity, and you start to see the futility of that and go, oh, hang on a minute. Do I want to just keep being right about something that creates suffering, or do I want to be free? Right. So they're both there. It's real and we honor that. But is it really true? And the true part is not the events, but the associated dialogue and narrative. And that's where there's some wiggle room. And that's ultimately where people can be liberated from the story, not the event, which is really powerful when you get it because I used to think, well, we can have some say about our future, right? Like, oh, okay, I'm going to commit to this college, I'm going to try this business venture, I'm going to go to the gym and get in shape, and it looks like we can at some level be the authors of our own creation of our life. But no one would argue that, well, you can't do anything about your past. And I really believed that for a while. And what I now realize is, okay, you might not be able to change the events, but you can change the associated narrative and story, which by default actually means you change your history, which is very powerful. So, again, not to condone the events, people go through abhorrent things, and I have all the love and compassion and patience to hear that and hold space for it. But I'm also committed to people being free from their history, which means that at some point, if they're committed to sort of liberation, they have to change the story that is defining them from their history.
Would you say that's the most difficult thing people deal with when you're coaching them regarding transforming themselves and kind of changing their mindset?
Yes, because our history, in terms of how our ego assimilates the events of our life, becomes who we are, right? It defines us. So the term I use, it's the you that you are for yourself, which might seem like weird language, but it's people talk about, oh, I've got limiting beliefs. Yes, that may be true, but those beliefs belong to the you that you are at a much deeper level. So it's like I'm asking people to literally let go of who they are. And that's the last frontier, right? Nobody wants to die, which is why I love this topic of death, even though it might be sort of dark for people, because it's really the death of the idea of yourself that no longer serves you, that is based in some sort of limiting language that's actually suffocating the potential of who you are as a being, which when people hear it that way, they're like, oh, well, holy shit, that sounds actually kind of inviting to die to this current limiting view of myself.
And I think human beings become like addicted to suffering in a really weird way, right? Where people go through traumatic events, they're having a hard time in life, and the thing that they want, I mean, and I'm just putting this very general, is they want happiness, meaning, fulfillment, connection in those times. The very thing they seek gives them the opposite: drugs, alcohol, pornography, toxic relationships, spending money on things they don't need. And that leads to even more suffering. Why do you think so many people do that when it's like the opposite of what they actually want?
To reiterate the point I just made, the ego's imperative is to be right. Right. Like, again, one of my quotes is, being right is a poor man's version of self worth, because even though we continue to fulfill on the very limiting narratives that define us, at least we know and we're familiar with the discomfort of our own identity. Right, which is bonkers when you get it. It's like, "Oh, I knew that was too good to be true," or "This won't last." The things that people say sort of on the superficial level that justify why things in their life aren't the way that they want them, because at least they get to be right about the deeper narrative that I'm not good enough, no one loves me, I'm worthless. And so that's the insidious nature of the ego, is that it's by design a limited structure. It's based in what I call, sort of, again, may seem like strange language, but a negation of self, where I'm not something. So if, without sounding too poetic and esoteric, if who I am and who we all are at the essence of our true nature is boundless, timeless, limitless, like this beautiful soul, infinite being, well, then we live in these constraints, which is why we suffer, because they're based in a negation. So I am everything, but the way that I perceive myself is I'm not many things, right? So you've got the infinite looking through the lens of the finite language of how we've characterized ourselves, and we have all the evidence from our childhood to reinforce it. So then we get to be right. So then we, just like shining a light through a 35 millimeter film, you are going to get the projection of whatever's on that film on the screen. So likewise, the light, again, without sounding overly poetic, that is our nature, shining through the light of shining through the dialogues of our subconscious, gives rise to, quote unquote, what presents on the screen, which we call our life. So it's sort of physics, really. If I'm walking around thinking I'm not good enough, then I have to, at some level, create that existence, because otherwise there's this dissonance, right? Like, you don't wake up in the morning as Doug and walk in to brush your teeth or wash your face and see, this brunette woman in front of you, in the mirror. I mean, maybe behind you, if I don't know whatever went on that night, but if it's just you in the bathroom, that would be a bit disturbing. You're like, that doesn't look anything like me, right? So we have this sort of idea of ourselves that's very ingrained over decades. And as a result, we think, feel, act from that place, which gives rise to the results that are going to be commensurate with that. Which is why, again, people with all the best intentions in the world go and see experts who tell them to do different things or stop doing what they're doing. But that's so far downstream, because who they are gives rise to the way they think, feel prior to the actions they take. So if they don't change that deep code, then it's really just willpower to try and go against the grain of your current automatic conditioning just by trying to do something that you don't do automatically. But if you can change the deep code at the subconscious level, then the actions you take are actually effortless.
I've heard you say that, you kind of have to have compassion for that part of yourself that's oblivious to these parts or this perspective of your life or of your identity that you're not aware of, that could actually be the very thing that leads to your transformation or reprogramming yourself at a subconscious level. Like, what are some ways you think, some simple ways, I guess, if you will, that people can start to develop more self-awareness around some of these subconscious patterns that are holding them back and creating this false narrative of how they're living their life?
I mean, the sort of obvious and not meaning to be flippant, but straightforward answer is just live life. Because wherever you go, there you are, and you are going to get triggered in the way that you're currently programmed or conditioned to be triggered, right? So the boss, the spouse, the kids, the parent, whoever it is that upsets you, is the opportunity to reveal these subconscious constraints. So you could sit at home and reflect and meditate and sit on the couch all day, but it's much more powerful to get out there in the world and see what pisses you off. And then, if you're willing to do the work, go, okay, what is it about that environment, that encounter, that comment that my brain is perceiving as a potential threat? Because that might seem like heavy language, but that's how the body is simulating that external data. Is that okay? Somebody said something or did something that I don't feel okay with. So it is really a state of fear that I can't be with whatever transpired. So what I'm actually saying to the world is I need things to be different in order for me to be okay. And that's the inquiry. Is that, okay, what is it about myself that is not able to be with the circumstance? Because again, unless it's, quote I say, unless it's life threatening, it is just ego threatening. And so that's the opportunity for growth. Of course, if it's life threatening, great, get yourself out of that situation, that relationship, or whatever it is. Don't stay there, right? But for the most part, 99.9999% of the time, it's really the identity that's being threatened and that is being triggered. And so live life, whilst most people have an avoidance tactic to things they don't like, meaning they don't talk to their parents, they don't engage with whoever it is that piss them off, they avoid someone at work. They are actually the teachers, right? Because if we're going to step into our bigger version of ourselves, more divine, more powerful, greater bandwidth to deal with life, then it's no different than going to the gym. Like, you want to face whatever creates resistance so that you get stronger, right? If somebody's like one of my pro athletes, I'm not going to take them to the gym and hand them 2 5-pound dumbbells and ask them if they can bench press. They're like, well, what the hell are you doing? This is a waste of my time. There's no resistance, right? So in life, we tend to just be very strategic in the way that we want to obviously mitigate any sorrow, suffering, and frustration. So we tend to cut people out of our lives. And I'm not saying that, of course, if there's somebody who's really abusive, confrontational, hostile, angry towards you, yeah, sure, you make a healthy choice for yourself. But if it's the normal, mundane, first standard deviation of human interactions, then wherever you get triggered is a gift to see where you can establish a greater sense of freedom and power for yourself.
I think as people are living life, and this is based on my own experience as well, where you start to say things like, I keep attracting the same person, or why do I keep making the same mistake, or why does this same pattern continue to limit me in my professional career? And then so as you're living life, you're also telling yourself this story to keep us safe, like kind of as you've described. But a lot of people, they don't get past that. That becomes the same story. Like, I keep attracting the same ex because it's about them. I keep messing up in my career because my boss sucks, or whatever the narrative is. How what are some, I guess, some symptoms of somebody's life that the person needs to then take a deeper look and say, okay, I definitely have some work I need to do.
So it's by flipping the script, right? So everything that you just described is very much in the realm of victimhood, right? I feel the way I feel because of fill in the blank, my boss, my spouse, my parents, my whatever. So what that is where the brain, which is designed to predict and protect because of past traumas or trials and tribulations and failures, we're survival instinct mammals where we want to avoid the repetition of something that hurt us. It's only, makes sense. But then what we're doing is we're saying, I am at the effect of whatever's happening around me, which, as I said, is a victim mindset. So we want to be able to recognize, oh, hang on a minute. No, there's what's happening. And I'm not saying it's ideal. I'm not saying it's easy. And it's certainly usually not what you want. But one, is actually creating our experience based on our reaction to it. And it's normally a reaction, right? Which is a past based phenomenon versus responding to what's happening, which could be a present state. Okay, yes, this is not necessarily the most pleasant engagement or conversation, but I can respond in a mature, wise way versus if I react because it's familiar to the way my dad used to raise his voice and I was very scared as a kid. And now I feel intimidated by this person. That's where you're actually living from this old version of yourself that thinks that it is a victim of life. And actually, what we all are is victims of perspective, meaning the way that we interpret life. And some of the things in life are really freaking difficult to deal with. So people are like, yeah, but what about blah, some real extremes that people go through that is, as a collective, agreed upon as being a victim of an attack, of abuse, of whatever. I understand, but from the point of view of being an empowered soul who's having this journey that you've curated to be able to emancipate yourself from the constraints with which you arrived, you can only do that if you take full responsibility for whatever's transpiring. So that's the only way out, is to realize, oh, I'm the one creating my experience based on the way that I'm interpreting life. And I'm attracting the circumstances to reveal those constraints so that I can break free, so that I do stop attracting the same partner. I do stop manifesting the same kind of middle management job where I'm not getting paid what I think I'm worth, because at the deepest level of my own identity, I have these beliefs or these conditioned narratives that make me feel somehow inadequate or insecure. Once I reconcile those, step out of that, then the circumstances of my life will automatically change, not because I'm trying to force anything.
And along these same lines, would you say that the idea of being right and our ego protecting us is at the root of self sabotage?
Pretty much, yeah. I don't know. It's a component of it. The root is really the fact that you are that version of you, meaning that's how you relate to life because of how you've defined yourself. The self sabotage is really the byproduct of that, right? It's like picking up a red pen and you write on paper and then you get pissed off because it's not blue. It's like, well, you could say that I'm sabotaging. I wanted to write in red. Yes, but that's because you've got a pen, an identity that is conditioned and programmed a certain way, and so it's going to produce what it produces, right? So until you shift the way that you are and how you're defined by your own deep narratives, then your thoughts, feelings, actions, and consequently results aren't going to shift. So manifestation is such a buzzword, especially in spiritual circles, where people think it's incumbent upon them to do something and it's based in time, right? So it's up to me, it's out there in the future, and it's fundamentally, so that creates time and it's outside of me. And for me, manifestation is actually an inside job, which is, oh, if I want a certain outcome, can I manifest the quote unquote frequency without again sounding too esoteric, but how would I be? How would I feel if that outcome was already part of my life? There'd be a certain amount of relief or joy or passion or vitality or happiness. If I were that frequency, then I think, feel, and act differently, which is the precursor to the actual event matching the frequency that I'd already aligned with.
And I think one of the things that I relate to with this is, and the reason I brought up the self sabotage thing is we both love golf, the Open Championships this weekend, right? I know for me, if I get up to the tee and I already know that when I'm playing around certain people that I'm not going to beat them, for the round, I'm not going to be as good as them. I just like to go out and have a good time. But if I get up to the tee and I think to myself, I'm going to slice this ball, I know that once I slice it, I'm like, see, told you. And then I'm proving to myself that I'm right. Do you think that's a way of your mind kind of tricking you?
Yes, that goes back to what I said earlier about, like, the imperative is to be right, right? The being right is the poor man's version of self-worth, right? So it's where we grapple with any sense of inherent value. And in this case, the value we get is being right about something we actually don't want, which when you realize it's pretty pathetic, right? It's human, so we have compassion, but it's like, oh, congratulations, you're being right about a shortcoming or an inadequacy. So what in this case of slicing a ball is really a reflection of your history that you don't want to happen, but is a tendency. And now your brain, before you've even hit the ball, is sort of predicting that outcome. So in order to give yourself a little bit of kind of a pat on the back, it's like, well, I'm predicting that based on my history, albeit that's incredibly unfulfilling. But at least if I tell everyone that's what I'm going to do, I kind of look good to some degree, even though I just lost my ball in the woods on the right.
Because the opposite kind of feels crappy, right? You're like, I'm going to hit this down the middle of the fairway. And then if you slice it, you feel like kind of ashamed, right? Because you're like, oh, I just publicly announced that I was going to do something. I didn't do it.
Right, because as human beings, I love the power of language. Obviously, that's what I traffic in is words and all of these deep programs that people have based in really sound, like the words that we've inherited and the events of our life that trigger these different narratives. So when you declare something but it doesn't happen, how that hits us is that I'm not very powerful because in the beginning there was the light, whatever it is in God's terms. And when light happens, it's like, holy, like you said something and it happened, right? That's why I love the word abracadabra, which people associate obviously with magic. Well, we're magical beings because as I speak, so I create is the translation of abracadabra, which is pretty cool, right? That's what abracadabra in Hebrew, I believe, translates to is as I speak, so I create. So if as we speak, we don't create, then it's sort of there's this aberration in our ability to be powerful beings and we feel a sense of inadequacy or shame. So once you realize that, we first have to clean up the spelling, the words we've got in the way, right? So, yes, you could say, I'm going to hit this right down the middle. But if the deeper code and programming you have is like last time I played, I've pretty much sliced off every tee box. Well, that's also a form of magic, right? Because it's black magic, but you're holding on to a story still as I speak, so I create that is way more profound than this sort of superficial hope that that's not going to happen. So, it's like a metaphor, an analogy. So if somebody's got a house that is, perhaps a little bit moldy, the furniture's old, the carpet's all, and they really want to have an interior designer come in and do everything to make their house beautiful and something that they're proud of and they enjoy the space of, I could be that interior designer and I could show up with all the most beautiful lead-free paints and gorgeous furniture from Restoration Hardware that's super expensive or whatever. But I can't take it into the house. Why? Because there's already something there, right? So we want to first recognize, okay, what is present currently in the way that I'm defined by these limitations, insecurities, and inadequacies and a sense of scarcity, dissolve those by seeing they're not truths. Then we're left actually with a clean slate, which is like for an artist, a blank canvas. Then you can create on it, right? So if you cleaned up your history of fears of shanking and slicing and whatever it is, so that I don't know what's going to happen on this tee because I've taken lessons, I've worked on my external rotator cuffs or whatever, so my body can drop the club into a more shallow position and all the things that would be the precursor to maybe a nice baby draw. Oh, okay. Well, now I've got a new slate from which I can create. Otherwise, we are literally being defined by our history, which is that self-fulfilling prophecy. Even if you're on a tee box and you just spent $500 on a new driver that's not meant to slice.
Or like $50 on a dozen golf balls that aren't meant to slice, right? Do you think it's harder for people to like reprogram their mindset if it's them that have made these mistakes over and over again versus something happening like kind of to them in their childhood with their family?
I think if there was a gradient of difficulty, yes, we could say if we are the evidence for our own shortcomings, then it becomes more convincing. I think a much bigger factor with regards to difficulty is age, right? Meaning the longer that we have had certain codes and programs in place, the more convincing and quote unquote, to go back to your question earlier about the distinction between real and true, the more true they seem because, well, now I've got not just, 16 years of evidence, I've got 46 years of evidence. So for sure, I'm up and nobody loves me, right? So the longer we live with the repetition of those particular outcomes, the more solid our perspective of life becomes, which we see in people's physiology, right? Like you look at a kid on a floor and they're in these pretzel positions with their knees and their elbows, and they're sitting in all sorts of, what seems to an adult like really difficult and uncomfortable positions, but because they have this pliability in their body, which to me is also, yes, anatomically because of the age they're at, but it's also a reflection of the flexibility of their mind. So the older we get, the more stubborn we get, the more callous we get in our views, tends to be reflective in people's actual physiology. And now people get stiff and they sort of take on these positions like an old person, which is, where I've just become calcified in a particular view of life, and my body's reflecting that. So stay nimble and flexible, my people.
I think about like one of my really good friends, and I know she won't mind me sharing this because we were talking about this last night, who's in her 50s, longtime drug addict, been sober, I think maybe for, maybe 9 years or so, but she's had a lot of trauma in sobriety, with relationship stuff. Both her parents died. Her cat, who she was super close with, also died. And she feels kind of just stuck. And I think there's people that are listening to this or watching this that just feel the same way, kind of alluding to what you just said about they're at a certain age and they're like, I have all this programming. I don't want to be a victim, but I also know that like this is going to take a long time to unwind this. What do you say to somebody like that who's it's just at a place where they just feel like time's running out and their mindset is already essentially just permanent?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to answer your question, what I'd say is like I'm sending a lot of love and compassion and understanding, and I get it. Being human is no walk in the park, right? And so I would then follow that up and say, as much as I can have real sympathy for somebody's situation, especially like your friend, I would say, well, if you're 50, you could equally be only halfway through your life. Like, what are you committed to the second half of your life looking like? And lean into the possibility of something versus looking back at the failure of something, right? And that can just in of it itself just inspire a little bit more excitement, a little more sense of opportunity, a little bit more inspiration to take better actions, whether it be the way she takes care of herself, and to rather be defined by our history to start to be informed by a future that really would appeal to her. So if she wants a partner, how would she feel? How would she act if she met this Prince Charming, who was beautiful and kind and adored her? She would, just from what I just shared, if she's listening to this, which if she's a friend of yours, she probably will at some point, she might feel a lightness in her body. She might like, oh my God, that would be amazing. The shoulders drop. And it's like, well, already you just shifted your energy a little bit, right? And live from that place. So I often ask people, the question of what is the future that you're sort of stepping into, right? What are you committed to, both in terms of something you're consciously creating, but if this were the future that is coming your way, who would you be and how would you feel right now? And it's a complete reversal of how the brain tends to work, which is in linear time from a past into the present into some perceived future, which is really just an extension of the that we're really not that proud of, or we certainly want to try and avoid. Again, I like using my quotes because they help people. I say, past hurt informs future fear. So wherever we've been hurt by things in our past, which let's face it, who hasn't? We're human. We tend to superimpose that as though that's what's going to happen again, and we're now trying to avoid it, which is that self-fulfilling prophecy. Versus if you recognize the nature of life is complete uncertainty. That's when I started my career 25 years ago, is I discovered these three words of I don't know. And I had all these things that I was trying to figure out, like it was around a girlfriend. Am I going to see her again? Was she dating someone else? And what I realized was the actual truth to those questions was, I don't know. And I found peace with that, which immediately opened up everything that could be available to me versus the concern for what might happen that then I now try to either manipulate, navigate, or whatever. It's really subtle. I did a talk yesterday, my first sort of live event, which was epic, and such a beautiful crowd. I worked with 4 people in it, and so moving. And one girl was very, I mean, they were all very vulnerable and courageous about the things they're dealing with. But one girl said, her roommate, she took her to a yoga class and she was hoping that she'd have a good workout because in her view, she's a big person. What does a big person mean? She's loud, a bit boisterous. And that reminded her of a parent who used to be a little overbearing. And so she was very subtly manipulating, hoping her roommate has a very good workout so she gets tired, which is really her avoiding the fear of a future, which is a reflection of the history that upset her. Does that make sense? And she's like, oh my God, no wonder I'm exhausted. So we manipulate life in a way that what we're actually trying to do is mitigate, reconcile, or avoid things that we still haven't accepted, versus recognizing, I don't know how the my roommate's going to act. And more powerful than that, I'm okay with it. She's a human being. It might not be ideal if she's noisy and loud and a bit of a bully or whatever, but I don't need to control that if I'm at peace with myself, right? So hopefully that helps people to realize, oh, wow, if you can really, truly let your history be, understand the nature of life, which is we're all clueless. I have no idea what's going to happen. I didn't know you were going to ask that question. I don't know what's going to happen the rest of my day. I have appointments and schedules, but I don't know what's going to transpire, what piece of random news, text, email I might get that would shift the course of my life. And so you stay open to, as I say, life surprising you, whilst, being responsible for what are you throwing into your history that is pretty unfulfilling and disempowering. Throwing into your future, which is disempowering and unfulfilling, based on the past that you're still trying to get away from.
Along these same lines, I think the word love gets thrown out a lot today for obvious reasons. And there's also like a lot of talk about I want to be loved for all of me. I want to be accepted for who I am. But I think a lot of times, just based on what we're talking about now, people, they don't love themselves fully. They only love like the good parts. How can somebody start to transcend that?
By understanding what love is, right? Love has sort of got this Hollywood connotation of you complete me and all the romance, which is beautiful. I love love. But what I realized is love makes space for all of it, right? So it's when people say, oh, self love, love yourself, it gets so misunderstood as though you're supposed to be going to the spa once a week and getting manicures and, getting massages, and that's all self love, or run yourself a bath with candles and listen to a meditation. That's all great. There's nothing wrong with that. But to me, real love is a little bit more fierce because it's big enough to make space for the parts of us that we don't love, right? Which sounds counterintuitive or paradoxical, but real love is like a parent to a child who, of course, they love the sweetness of when their child falls asleep and they see the innocence of them just in this dream state where, oh my God, my child is so beautiful. Or they love it when they bring them a drawing that, you can barely tell what it is, but it's the intention the child did something for you. Or they love them when they're laughing and they're having fun. But a real parent who's coming from unconditional love also makes space for when the child is having a tantrum, when the child is being a freaking pain in, when the child is sulking, when the child is saying, I hate you, so that's real love, is to actually be big enough that we can hold all of it as the container for somebody to show up with every expression of who they are as a human being. To do that for oneself is not easy, but it is such a gift, because then if you can hold all parts of you, you at least give someone else the opportunity to do the same. And you certainly extend that to other people, which I would say is the greatest gift you could give another human being, which is allow them to be all of who they are.
And so taking this one step further, I don't know if this is the exact quote you shared earlier, but I've heard you talk about this before, in that like the relationships we have in our life in a way reflect the parts of us, the version of us that aren't healed, right? Like why does that happen? Like what is our body and mind kind of doing on a daily basis that would cause us to attract people like that?
Well, from Peter Crone's perspective, because that's the whole intention of being here on planet Earth in this dimension as a human being, is to transcend and break free from the constraints with which we arrived, right? If we want to get poetic again, it's like the gods are like, okay, you're a beautiful soul, but you're still bound in these feelings of inadequacy and security. We've got just the place for you. It's called planet Earth because it's a show and you're going to get triggered left, right, and center. And so that's the place where you can work out all of the stuff that's still, confining you, right? So that to me is the raison d'etre of being human. It's not to amass more money, get married, have kids, get a bigger home, and hopefully, make a ton of cash. It's actually to break free. That to me is the purpose of what it is to be human, is to dissolve, discover the constraints, the prisons that are wrapped around the limitless, boundless, timeless being that we are, so that we can return to our divine state, which is all of it. And most people do the opposite, right? They avoid through escapisms of, whatever it is, alcohol, nicotine, weed, medication, street drugs, sex, TV, food, to avoid the pain and the fear and the suffering. When in fact, for me, the most powerful human being who's willing to lean into it and go, okay, like if I'm going to be powerful and free, I've got to be able to look at the things that currently confine me, because that's my project here on planet Earth, is ultimately why I call my product freedom, is to break free and find freedom in all areas of your life.
Have you worked with anybody specifically that was like knee deep in addiction, like drug addiction?
Knee deep is going to be interpreted based on whoever's listening. I would say I've worked with somebody who's pretty attached to their addiction. I think most people who are really in it are just in it, right? Like they're not really seeking help. I think if someone came to like a Peter Crone or a therapist, psychiatrist, coach, or anyone who's going to facilitate, they can't be really in the depths of the despair of an addiction. I think they're familiar with it. They know that they have it, but maybe there's a certain degree of manageability about it. So the people that I've helped typically are more than anything scared that they might relapse or get deeper into it again. They might still be using whatever their substance of choice is. But I can't say like I'm picking up a crack addict from the streets, and transforming their life. I don't think they're interested. They're just waiting for the next hit.
So it's more about working with somebody that is optimistic and has accountability and responsibility and this desire to want to get better.
Yeah, somebody who's proactively wanting to make a change. I think you have to start with that with any arena, whether it's their health, their addictions, their relationships, their finances. Yeah, it has to be a co-creation, especially if I'm going to help. I consider myself to be pretty adept at what I do, and powerful in the way that I can help people really shift perspectives. But I ain't no wizard. I can't do it without their help.
And what are some of the big perspective shifts you have people who are recovering from addiction that are wanting to get help? Like what do they need help with the most?
Gosh, it runs the gamut. Usually it's a pretty darker version of some negation, like I was talking about, like somebody might not be not good enough. It would be the darker version of that is like, I'm bad. Like I'm just a bad person. Because see, if you look at it energetically, if somebody thinks they're not good enough, they're sort of somewhat being informed by the thing they want, which is to be good. I'm just not good enough. So it tends to inspire someone to become a people pleaser, a perfectionist, or work harder. But if somebody is something negative, like I'm bad, I'm trash, I'm worthless, it has a little bit more gravity and, to your point earlier, a little bit more truth for that person, because they're like, well, see, I was kicked out of my family and I was the black sheep of the family. And so they've got real evidence as to leaning into the derogatory way of defining themselves versus trying to compensate for the more positive way of defining ourselves. So usually we have to look at that first and undo that. Like I was saying, if I'm going to redesign someone's in their house, I've got to remove all the mold that's in there, which would be this derogatory narrative. One of the most powerful things actually for addiction is community. If you think about it from a very physiological point of view, we as human beings, we want a sense of belonging, which we could say is a way that we bond with one another. This is why I love, right? It's where we connect, we commune. And so what I find to be sort of present almost 100% of the time with people who struggle with addiction is a feeling of isolation, a feeling of separation. And so they find bonding with the substance. So to have great community, people who generally love them, we tend to dismiss and shame people who are drug addicts, right? Which is only further leveraging and in kind of exacerbating that feel of isolation and separation. So actually, it's sort of embracing, it's loving, right? So for me, I come from such a deep sense of true love and compassion for somebody who's going through that, so that they can find solace bonding with me at least, and they feel a connection. Because when we have established connections with other human beings, we tend not to want to sabotage our life, because we're committed to maintaining the vitality, the joy, and the health of those relationships. But if I'm isolated, I mean, look at it in prisons, right? What's the worst thing that can happen to somebody who's incarcerated is they go into solitary confinement. And that's where the mind tends to go into entropy, and we tend to just lean into death and disorder, right? So usually there is a deep, profound sense of being alone. And this is where people have found solace, is in a substance. So if we can sort of tweak that undo all of the feelings of inadequacy and dismissive, sort of not wanted, worthless energy, and then find a different form of bond, connection, this time with humans who actually give a shit and who care. And again, that I get it. Some of these people came from environments where there was a single parent who was a drug addict, who was an alcoholic. They didn't tend to their needs. They weren't affectionate. There was no touch. There was definitely no "I love yous." That's like foreign to people who tend towards drugs and addiction or even crime. I saw a video called "Step Inside the Circle" where somebody I actually did some work with, Fritzy, she goes and works with these inmates, and they're in a big circle, and she asks a series of questions that are, challenging questions like, were you raised by a single parent? Was one of your parents abusive? Were one of your parents a drug addict? And if it's yes, they keep stepping inside the circle, and you start to see, holy, these human beings never stood a chance. Like, they don't even know what love is. They don't know what any sort of accolades, acknowledgments, or approval, or good boy, good girl is. Like that's foreign to them as Mandarin Chinese is to me. And so then you have a lot more compassion. So undo these derogatory, albeit self-created narratives with sometimes horrific circumstances for children, and appeal to the deeper sense of true, boundless, limitless nature of someone's soul, and then reinforce it with beautiful community where people actually come from a very loving, non-judgmental place.
As somebody I've been in recovery for almost 16 years, and I've talked about this before, where I think the challenge with getting sober and getting into recovery is that you've been using a substance for a period of time to numb all this pain, all this suffering, and make you feel good. And it works until it doesn't, right? And then now typically when people are getting sober, it's because their life is crap, right? It's not like their life's super good and they're like, oh, it's time for me to like give up the drug. It's normally something happens in a relationship, legally, etc. And then you're left in a place where you've had the substance that's been this cure for your suffering ripped away from you, and then your self-esteem and self-confidence is crap. Right? So now you're in this really weird place of like, how do you move forward? It's the same thing I think with getting out of a toxic relationship where you've been like emotionally abused, where you have this thing that there was this connection, even though it was a bad connection, while at the same time you're being abused. So your self-esteem is crap. I guess with that said, anything you do with some of the people that you work with to help them like kind of build their self-confidence from the ground up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer. You can't really build self-confidence. You just have to see the lie that is creating the lack of confidence, right? So I would assert confidence is there. Love is there, self-worth is there, freedom is there, power is there. Like these characteristics that we try to amass or attain from the ego level, that's actually who we are at the deepest level. So again, that's why I don't solve problems, I dissolve them. So what we want to do is dissolve what is the conversation on top of all of these beautiful attributes that is the antithesis to confidence, right? I'm a piece of shit. No one cares about me. I'm trash. I'm worthless. No one loves me, right? If that's the lens we're looking through, then yeah, there's going to be the absence of confidence. So that's what most people try to do is they unconsciously hold on to this limiting them based on the narrative, and then they try to compensate for it and build on top of it. Conversely, what I'm doing is no, just remove the limitation by saying it's not a truth. Is it absolutely true that you're worthless? Well, it feels that way, right? But it's not a truth that it feels that way. And well, my mum said I was a piece of shit. She didn't want me. Okay, that's one person out of 8 billion, and you just absolutely absorb those words as though it's a truth. No, who you are as a divine being. Again, I know this gets poetic and there are real life situations to deal with here, but if you can lean into a little bit of going, okay, who am I? This is a spiritual inquiry. Am I this, meat suit? Am I Peter Crone? No, that's a sound someone gave me. My parents called me Peter. It's not who I am. It's helpful in terms of time and space. So if I walk on the street and someone says, "Hey, Peter, how you doing?" Like I can respond, But in terms of recognizing all these labels that we adopt and these conversations that define us, we want to inquire into the truth of them, and certainly those that are very derogatory or limiting. So self-confidence is there. It's called self-love, which called, I am. It's self-awareness. I exist. I'm the only me on the planet. That means I'm 1 in 8 billion. That's pretty special. Even if I don't do anything, I'm a unique vantage point on life, right? Doesn't mean that anyone wants to listen to it, or it doesn't mean that it's really going to get me paid, but it is nonetheless. I'm a unique aspect of life, and to me, that warrants reverence, right? And that then is confidence. Then on top of that, I'm a unique expression of life. I might have a story based on the circumstances of my childhood, which is, oh, but actually the way I view myself is I'm a piece of. Okay, well, if that's how you view yourself, you are gonna choose feelings and actions that are commensurate with that. That's gonna lead to, sort of a very unfulfilling, deleterious life. But that's not who you are. So all of this is about inquiring into, as I said earlier, the validity of the way that I've currently defined myself. I get it. I have so much compassion for why people feel worthless, and especially on the things they've experienced, from sexual abuse to physical abuse to emotional abuse. These are horrible things that any child, should never really go through. But sadly, that is the arc of someone's karma, and that's what they're here to deal with. But if we can get on the other side of the stories that you made up about it, boy, is there just an immense amount of freedom.
Other than a lot of these like mindset perspective shifts that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, is there anything else that you either do personally or you recommend people doing, like journaling or something like that, where it gets their thoughts like out on paper to kind of get them in front of them?
Yeah, that can help because it gets it out of here where it's so intimate to us, right? That we think the thoughts in our head are us. So I often do have people do that exercise, like write down how you describe yourself, what you think about yourself, and then ideally leave it for a few hours or a day or two and come back and read it and go, holy, like if this was a friend of mine, I'd be like, dude, like you have the worst view of yourself. Like you're awesome. Like, right. So that can be powerful, enlightening, and sometimes confrontational to look at the way that we talk about ourselves, right? And then by taking it out of our head, putting it on paper, reading it as though it is literally a friend or someone you genuinely care about, you start to naturally develop a bit of compassion and go, wow, like what must it be like for that human being to walk around in that view of themselves? It's really kind of sad, and then you get inspired to maybe, just maybe, get beyond that and say, that's it's just not who I want to be. That's not how I want to live life.
One of the other things that people I think have a hard time with when they're trying to make a transformation, this goes into health transformations, goes into business, relationship, addiction, is the attachment to the transformation or the outcomes in itself, and like being present. It's hard. I mean, you've talked about the importance of being present on this show, but it's hard. It's easier said than done. Like, what advice do you have for somebody to, again, easier said than done, not be so focused on the outcome of the transformation, but instead be present in the moment, in the journey?
Yeah, it is hard. And I look at it slightly differently. Like even sports psychologists, I've worked with, probably thousands of athletes at this time, just because in baseball seasons, a couple of hundred guys sitting in a locker room in spring training. But there's so much emphasis from sports psychs of like, be present, be in the now, and be in the zone. And it's sort of instructional, right? And that's great. You want that. But why it's so difficult for people to actually achieve and attain is because it's not natural from somebody who's got a history that they are hurt by and a future that they're worried about. Then what happens is our attention tends to be dispersed in both directions, where we haven't fully accepted something, which is part of our history because of the feeling of shame or guilt or failure, disappointment, anger. And so that creates where some of our attention goes. And then that tends to, as I say, get reflected into a future where we're trying to mitigate that and avoid it being repeated. So then you've got those two things that we're holding on to whilst saying, no, but I'm going to be present. So really the access to presence is when we're not attending to the psychology of time, meaning, look, my history is what it is. I've fucked up plenty. I did what I did. I was always doing the best I could within the realm of my own awareness and my skill at the time. And I can have just so much compassion and forgiveness for myself. I've learned along the way. Hopefully today I'm a far more mature, evolved, and wise human being than I was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So for that reason, I recognize I couldn't have done anything different because I, one, didn't do anything different. And secondly, I didn't know to do anything different based on my current conditioning. Even if I knew I should have done something different, whatever the fear was that didn't allow me to do that was still stronger.
And then when it comes to like setting goals, Like I think a lot of times when people are trying to make these massive changes in their life, they try to go from like 0 to 100, or they see the end goal in sight, and that again can create this unhealthy relationship with time, because now you're looking at it like, oh, I want to lose 100 pounds. Well, that's going to take forever, so I might as well not even do it. Or I want to have $1 million in the bank. It's going to take so long. Might as well not even do it. What are some best practices for goal setting, for when you're working with people to try to achieve certain things in their life so that it's manageable and they can stay on track with whatever it is they're doing?
With regards to goals, like for me, I think less is more sometimes, and especially to meet someone with their current capacity or wherever they're at in terms of their own sense of self worth and confidence. I used to have a sign across my desk in my office that said, just do one thing, because I'm a Virgo. I love making lists. So I could have a to do list that's like 300 things, that I've got to accomplish for my life, but it seems like I've got to do them all today. And then it becomes overwhelming. I felt oppressed and depressed. And I'm like, God, what's the point? But if I could just, and this is now a practice of mine, sure, I think it's helpful to get everything out of your head onto some sort of piece of paper or an app or whatever that you can trust where everything is located, so you don't have to hold on to it mentally, and then cherry pick, the 3 or 4 things you want to do today, so it seems very manageable. So that's a way that I feel goals become both expeditious in their realization, but also kind of fun in the process of creating them, is that this is manageable. I'm not putting immense amount of pressure on myself, and I'm still garnering the sense of achievement by keep moving forward. So I really like the attitude of less is more when it comes to goals. Like, you can have audacious goals, that's great. I have some pretty big ones, but if you stay out there, it just seems unattainable. Versus, there's a lot of people who do productivity workshops and speak to this. Like, SMART goals is an acronym people can look up. But if you can reverse engineer even your biggest goals to, okay, well, if I am to quote unquote have my own like retreat center in Costa Rica in a year, like, what do I have to do today? So, well, maybe I send a couple of emails to people who want to invest. I can manage that.
How important is it to stack like small wins and celebrate those when it comes to like reprogramming our subconscious mind?
I think it's very important, especially if somebody's coming from a place where they've been struggling with their self worth. Like, I think it's very easy to assimilate the things we've done and accomplished immediately, and then still focus on the horizon that we're not at. Right. So I think it's really important to give yourself the props and that sense of accomplishment and achievement for whatever it is you did, for however small of an undertaking it was. So that builds then that sense of real trust in oneself, that, like, okay, I got this. Because otherwise we can just become so future oriented and what we don't have, which again reinforces the ego's sense of scarcity or lack or inadequacy. So I think it's really important. Whatever it is that you did today, is first of all what you did today. You couldn't have done more. Why? Because you didn't. And to pat yourself on the back for whatever little thing you accomplished. And some days you'll be on fire and you're like, I got 20 things done today. That's awesome. But if the next day you only do 2, well, that's 2 more than you might have done if you just sat around and done nothing.
How can somebody change the narrative around the coulda, shoulda, woulda like mentality? Like, I could have done more, I could have done less. Like, I could have done this differently. I heard you talk about this, I think, in the context of like you were selling somebody a domain, I think, and you met some guy at a restaurant and you were talking about he was talking about how he could have done something else. And you're like, no, you couldn't have.
Yeah, but I mean, this one to me is relatively easy because you couldn't have done anything else because you didn't. Right. And that can be confronting for the ego. It's like, wait, what did he just say? Like, well, I should have done that. I should no, but you shouldn't and you couldn't, because if you really understand the nature of life, we're just here, and whatever transpired, it's one of my most popular quotes. People even have it tattooed, is what happened happened and couldn't have happened any other way because it didn't. Right. And there's so much humility to be found in that, not to mention forgiveness too. It's like, okay, like I said earlier, I did the best I could in every choice of my life based on what I knew at the time. Okay, we want to keep knowing more, hopefully evolving, becoming more mature and wise and intelligent with our choices. But whatever we did couldn't have been different because it wasn't. So it's a relatively easy question to answer. Hard maybe for people to accept and assimilate, but the facts of the facts are, they're not going to change.
Anything else you think people would find like helpful as we kind of round out our conversation as far as reprogramming the subconscious mind, transformation, mindset shifts, etc.?
Sure, I would just, maybe look at the word reprogram. I don't think it's so much a reprogram as I said before, as a dissolution of, right? It's not so much you're trying to reprogram what's there, but rather to become aware of what's there. It's like Carl Jung had a quote that I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. Right. So we're bringing that which is a blind spot, that which we're oblivious to, which is why we want to have compassion, right? Because you don't know what you don't know, and that's okay. We're all blind at, certain levels of our own consciousness and awareness. And so we want to, through being triggered in life, through hopefully the guidance of loved ones who can point out some of our characteristics that might not be our greatest assets and attributes, and then go, okay, oh wow, I can see that since I was 5, I decided or believed that I was not wanted, I wasn't loved, I wasn't good enough. And so bring that. So it's not so much reprogram that, rather bring awareness to it, investigate if it's true. And I can tell you right now, it never is. And then the next question would be, who could I be in the absence of that constraint? And that opens up an entirely new world of freedom and a sense of pure possibility.
Freedom. That's what it's all about, right?
Yes, sir.
Peter Crone, this has been awesome. Thanks again for coming back on the podcast. You're always welcome here. If people want to learn more about your work, if they're not familiar with it already, if they want to connect with you online, where's the best place to do that?
So they can on Instagram at Peter Crone. So just my name. My website is also just petercrone.com, which has got everything. And if they are interested in finding freedom, I just a few months ago launched what I feel will be my legacy over the years, is a safe space of unconditional love where people connect to find freedom in all areas of their life, whether it be finances, health, relationship, career. And that is just called Freedom. And all of that information is on my website. We made it super affordable. It's just, I think right now, about $8,000 worth of content in there for $29 a month.
Awesome, man. Well, again, thank you for coming back on the show. The audience is going to get a lot of value out of this, and I did as well.
Great. It's good to see you, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.